My life was, well, it was boringly normal. I worked a steady job in IT, lived in a cookie-cutter suburban development, and spent my weekends tinkering with my pride and joy, a vintage Ford F-150. That truck wasn't just transportation, it was a project, a hobby, a piece of my soul poured into chrome and engine grease. I'd spent years restoring it, and every scratch and ding told a story of late nights in the garage and weekend road trips. Then came the HOA. At first, it was innocuous enough, the occasional reminder about lawn maintenance or trash can placement. Annoying, sure, but nothing I couldn't handle. I diligently kept my grass trimmed, made sure my trash cans were hidden away, and generally tried to be a good neighbor. But then, the notices started to become more frequent, more pointed. It started with a complaint about the unsightly oil stains on my driveway, courtesy of my beloved truck. I cleaned them immediately, but it was like opening Pandora's box. Next, it was the excessive noise from my garage while I was working on the engine, during daylight hours, mind you. Then, a violation for parking my truck too close to the curb. It was always something, and it always felt personal. I started to suspect one particular HOA board member was behind it all, a woman we all secretly, and not so secretly, called HOA Karen. She seemed to relish enforcing the rules, and she always had a smug look on her face whenever she saw me. The tension was building, a slow burn of frustration and resentment that was about to explode. I just didn't know how spectacularly it would all go down, or that the FBI would somehow be involved. All I knew was that my truck, and my sanity, were on the line. That first oil stain notice was the pebble that started the avalanche. I cleaned it up, of course, but it felt like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down. The next week, another notice appeared, this time complaining about the excessive noise emanating from my garage. I was rebuilding the carburetor on the F-150, and yes, it involved some clanging and banging, but it was during reasonable hours, and I wasn't exactly running a heavy metal concert. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, hoping to reason with them, to explain that I wasn't intentionally causing any trouble. That's where I first encountered HOA Karen face to face. Her real name was Brenda, but everyone in the neighborhood knew her by her unofficial title. She was a small woman, but she carried herself with an air of authority that seemed disproportionate to her actual power. When I tried to explain my side of the story, she cut me off, citing specific clauses in the HOA agreement that I apparently violated. Her tone was condescending, her words dripping with thinly veiled disdain. It was clear she wasn't interested in hearing my explanation, she was simply enjoying wielding her power. After that meeting, the notices became even more frequent, and the violations became increasingly petty. A weeds violation for a single dandelion in my perfectly manicured lawn. A parking violation for my truck's tires being an inch over the line of my driveway. It was relentless, a campaign of harassment designed to make my life miserable. I started documenting everything, taking pictures of the alleged violations, keeping records of the dates and times of the notices. I knew this wasn't just about lawn care or parking, it was personal. HOA Karen had it out for me, and I had no idea why. I just knew that things were about to get a whole lot worse. The morning it happened started like any other. I woke up, made coffee, and glanced out the window at my truck, a ritual I performed every day. Except this morning, something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The space where my F-150 usually sat was empty. My heart leaped into my throat. I rushed outside, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The driveway was bare, except for a glint of metal on the ground. I knelt down and picked it up. It was a piece of a padlock, the one I used to secure the steering wheel of my truck. It had been cleanly cut. My truck was gone. Stolen. My immediate thought. HOA Karen. Who else would have a motive? Who else had been making my life a living hell for the past few months? It seemed too coincidental, too perfectly timed. This felt like the ultimate escalation, the culmination of her petty harassment. The anger boiled inside me, a furious rage that threatened to consume me. I wanted to march straight to her house and demand answers, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. I needed to call the police, file a report, and try to remain calm, even though every fiber of my being wanted to scream. As I stood there, staring at the empty space in my driveway, a wave of despair washed over me. It wasn't just a truck, it was my truck. It was years of hard work, countless hours of dedication, a piece of my history. And now, it was gone, likely thanks to the spiteful actions of one power-hungry HOA board member. But little did I know, the theft of my truck was only the beginning of a much larger, much stranger story, one that involved the FBI and a criminal conspiracy unfolding right next door. The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity. First, the 911 call, my voice shaking as I reported the theft. Then, the arrival of the police, their questions sharp and probing. I explained about the HOA, about Brenda, HOA Karen, and the ongoing harassment. The officer took notes, his expression neutral, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. It probably sounded like a petty squabble blown out of proportion. After the police left, I couldn't contain myself any longer. I marched over to Brenda's house, my anger barely controlled. I rang the doorbell, and she answered, a look of feigned surprise on her face. "Brenda," I said, my voice tight with rage, "my truck is gone. Stolen. And I know you had something to do with it." She blinked innocently. "Oh, that's terrible. I can't imagine what that must be like." Her voice dripped with insincerity. "Don't play dumb with me," I snapped. "You've been harassing me for months. This is just the next step, isn't it?" "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm just trying to uphold the rules of the HOA. If you hadn't been violating them, none of this would have happened." Gaslighting. That's what it was. She was trying to make me feel like I was the one in the wrong, like I had brought this on myself. "You're lying," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "I'm going to find out what you did, and I'm going to make sure you pay for it." I turned and stormed back to my house, my frustration reaching a boiling point. The police weren't taking me seriously, Brenda was denying everything, and my truck was still missing. I felt helpless, lost, and utterly alone. Little did I know, the cavalry was already on its way, disguised as a seemingly ordinary stakeout next door. As the initial shock of the truck theft began to subside, and the police had wrapped up their initial investigation, which felt more like a formality than a genuine effort, I started to notice something strange happening next door. My neighbors, the Millers, were unremarkable. They kept to themselves, mowed their lawn, put up Christmas decorations, the very definition of suburban normalcy. But suddenly, their house was attracting a lot of attention. It started subtly. Unmarked sedans parked down the street, their windows tinted dark. Men in dark suits standing around, talking into their sleeves. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination, the product of stress and paranoia. But the activity intensified. The cars became more frequent, the men in suits more obvious. They were clearly watching the Miller's house. One afternoon, while I was outside aimlessly pacing, trying to figure out what to do about my stolen truck, I saw a black SUV pull up directly across the street from the Miller's house. Two men in suits got out, scanned the area, and then casually leaned against the vehicle, their eyes fixed on the house. That's when it hit me, this wasn't random. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a stakeout. But who were these guys? And why were they watching the Millers? Were the Millers involved in something shady? And, most importantly, could this somehow be connected to the theft of my truck and HOA Karen's relentless harassment? The thought was absurd, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was connected in some bizarre, inexplicable way. The FBI staking out my neighbor's house was the last thing I expected, but it was about to turn my world upside down even further. The mystery of the stakeout gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to my stolen truck and HOA Karen's harassment. It was a long shot, I knew, but I needed to find out more. So, I did what any self-respecting suburbanite would do, I gossiped with the neighbors. Old Mrs. Henderson, who lived across the street from the Millers, was my best bet. She had a knack for knowing everything that went on in the neighborhood. I casually approached her while she was tending her roses, pretending to admire her blooms. "Those are lovely, Mrs. Henderson," I said. "Say, have you noticed anything unusual going on at the Miller's house lately?" She peered at me over her spectacles, her eyes twinkling. "Unusual? Oh, you mean the men in suits?" "Yes, dear, I've seen them. Been here for weeks, haven't they?" "Weeks?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Do you know who they are?" "FBI, dear," she whispered, leaning closer. "FBI. Been staking out the Miller's house. Something about suspected criminal activity. Drugs, maybe? Or money laundering? I don't know the specifics, but it's definitely the FBI. FBI." The word hung in the air, heavy with implications. The Millers, my quiet, unassuming neighbors, were suspected of criminal activity, and the FBI had been watching them for weeks. This was far beyond anything I could have imagined. The revelation sent a jolt through me. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The stolen truck, HOA Karen's harassment, the FBI stakeout, could they all be pieces of the same puzzle? The idea seemed crazy, but I couldn't dismiss it. I had a feeling that my ordinary suburban life was about to become a lot less ordinary, and a lot more dangerous. The revelation about the FBI stakeout opened up a Pandora's box of possibilities, each more outlandish than the last. But one question kept nagging at me: could HOA Karen be involved in whatever the FBI was investigating next door? It seemed absurd, I know. Brenda, the queen of petty HOA violations, a criminal mastermind? But the timing was too suspicious, the escalation too sudden. And the more I thought about it, the more little details started to surface in my memory, things I had previously dismissed as insignificant. Like the time I saw Brenda's car parked outside the Miller's house late at night. Or the hushed conversations I overheard between her and Mr. Miller near the community mailbox. Or the way she always seemed to know exactly when I was working on my truck, as if she were watching me. Could it be that the HOA harassment wasn't just about petty rules and regulations? Could it be that she was trying to drive me out of the neighborhood for some other reason, a reason connected to the criminal activity next door? And then there was the truck theft. Could that also be connected? Maybe my truck was needed for something, used as a getaway vehicle or to transport illegal goods. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I knew I was probably grasping at straws, letting my imagination run wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that I was caught in the middle of something much bigger than a simple HOA dispute. I had to find out the truth, even if it meant putting myself in danger. The question was, how? And where do I even begin? The amateur sleuth in me was awakening, ready to dive into the murky depths of suburban crime. From that moment on, I was no longer just a disgruntled suburbanite with a stolen truck, I was an amateur sleuth on a mission. I started my investigation by focusing on two key targets, HOA Karen and the Miller's house. I began documenting everything. Every time I saw Brenda leave her house, I noted the time, the direction she went, and any details about her car. I even started taking pictures, discreetly, of course. I also kept a close watch on the Miller's house, noting the comings and goings of visitors, the types of vehicles that arrived, and any other unusual activity. My IT skills came in handy. I set up a rudimentary surveillance system using an old webcam and some motion detection software. I positioned it to overlook the Miller's driveway, hoping to capture something incriminating. I also started digging into public records, searching for any connections between Brenda and the Millers, any shared business ventures, or any other red flags. It was tedious work, and I often felt like I was wasting my time. But I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how crazy it seemed. I spent hours poring over data, analyzing photographs, and reviewing surveillance footage. My house became a makeshift detective agency, filled with maps, timelines, and photos of my suspects. I knew I was walking a dangerous line. I was interfering with an FBI investigation, and I was potentially putting myself in harm's way. But I couldn't stop. The thought of HOA Karen being involved in something criminal, the thought of my truck being used for nefarious purposes, fueled my determination. I had to know the truth, even if it meant risking everything. Days turned into weeks, and my amateur investigation started to yield some disturbing results. After countless hours of poring over surveillance footage and public records, I finally found a connection between HOA Karen, Brenda, and the Millers. It started with the cars. I noticed that Brenda's car, a late-model Buick, was often seen parked near a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a warehouse that I later discovered was owned by a shell corporation linked to Mr. Miller. The same warehouse was also frequented by a black van that I had seen parked outside the Millers' house on several occasions. Then, I found a financial connection. Brenda was listed as a silent partner in a small landscaping business that the Millers owned. It seemed innocuous enough, but the business had a suspiciously high turnover rate and reported minimal profits, despite its seemingly constant activity. But the most damning evidence came from my surveillance footage. One night, I captured a video of Brenda and Mr. Miller meeting in a park late at night. They were talking in hushed tones, and although I couldn't hear what they were saying, their body language was clearly conspiratorial. They exchanged a small package, and then Brenda drove off in her Buick. The pieces were starting to fall into place. It was becoming increasingly clear that Brenda wasn't just a petty HOA tyrant, she was involved in something much bigger, something criminal. And the Millers were at the center of it all. The thought that my truck might have been stolen to further their criminal enterprise made my blood boil. I had to decide what to do with this information. Should I continue my investigation, risking further exposure? Or should I take my findings to the authorities, and trust that they would take action? The stakes were getting higher, and I knew I couldn't afford to make the wrong decision. As I pieced together the evidence, the weight of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just about a stolen truck or petty HOA squabbles anymore, this was serious criminal activity, potentially involving drugs, money laundering, or something even worse. And I, an ordinary IT guy, was right in the middle of it. The realization that I was interfering with an FBI investigation hit me hard. These weren't local cops dealing with a minor theft, these were federal agents investigating serious crimes. And my amateur sleuthing could potentially compromise their operation, put them at risk, or even alert the suspects to their presence. But the biggest concern was my own safety. If Brenda and the Millers were involved in criminal activity, who knew what they were capable of? They had already stolen my truck, and if they suspected I was onto them, they might not hesitate to take more drastic measures. I started to feel paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every unexpected sound. I installed extra locks on my doors and windows, and I even considered buying a gun, something I never thought I would do. I knew I was in over my head. I was an amateur playing in a professional league, and I was quickly realizing that I didn't have the skills, the resources, or the experience to handle this situation. It was time to make a decision. I could continue my investigation, hoping to uncover even more evidence, but risking my safety and potentially jeopardizing the FBI's operation. Or I could turn over what I had to the authorities, and trust that they would handle it from there. The choice was clear, even though it was difficult to admit that I couldn't solve this on my own. My days of playing detective were coming to an end. Making the decision to contact the FBI was the easy part. Actually doing it was terrifying. I imagined myself walking into their office, rambling about stolen trucks, HOA Karens, and criminal conspiracies, and being laughed out of the building. I was just a random guy with a wild story. Why would they believe me? I found the number for the local FBI field office online and hesitated for what felt like an eternity before finally dialing. My hands were sweating, and my voice trembled as I spoke to the receptionist, trying to explain that I had information about a possible criminal investigation they were conducting in my neighborhood. She sounded skeptical, but she eventually agreed to connect me with an agent. I held my breath, waiting for the agent to pick up, bracing myself for dismissal. "Agent Thompson speaking," a voice said on the other end of the line. I took a deep breath and launched into my story, starting with the stolen truck and the HOA harassment, and then moving on to the FBI stakeout next door, my amateur investigation, and the connections I had uncovered between Brenda and the Millers. I tried to be as clear and concise as possible, but I knew I probably sounded like a raving lunatic. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I braced myself for the inevitable rejection. "Mr. Agent Thompson," finally said. "Johnson," I replied, "Mark Johnson." "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice measured, "this is a very interesting story. I can't make any promises, but I'm going to look into it. Can you come down to the office tomorrow morning and bring all the evidence you've collected?" I was stunned. He was actually taking me seriously. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely crazy after all. The next morning, I arrived at the FBI field office, clutching a box filled with my painstakingly collected evidence, photos, videos, timelines, financial records, the fruits of my amateur sleuthing. I felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation as I was ushered into a conference room where Agent Thompson and another agent, a woman named Agent Reynolds, were waiting for me. They were surprisingly attentive. They listened patiently as I recounted my story, occasionally asking clarifying questions. They examined my evidence, poring over the photos and videos, and reviewing the financial records. The more they looked, the more interested they seemed to become. After a couple of hours, Agent Thompson leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "I have to admit, when I first spoke to you on the phone, I was skeptical. But after reviewing your evidence, I can see that you've uncovered some valuable information." Agent Reynolds nodded in agreement. "In fact," she said, "your information confirms some of our own suspicions about Brenda, HOA Karen. She is, in fact, a person of interest in our investigation." I was stunned. They already knew about Brenda. They knew she was involved. My amateur investigation hadn't been a waste of time after all. Agent Thompson continued, "We can't tell you the specifics of our investigation, but I can say that Brenda and the Millers are suspected of being involved in a large-scale money laundering operation. Your evidence has helped us to solidify our case against them." He paused, then added, "We're also very interested in the fact that your truck was stolen. We believe it may have been used to transport illegal goods." Finally, some validation. Finally, someone was taking my truck theft seriously. It wasn't just a random act of vandalism, it was part of a larger criminal enterprise. Armed with the information I had provided, the FBI launched a more targeted phase of their investigation. They intensified their surveillance of Brenda and the Millers, and they started tracking the vehicles associated with them, including the black van and, crucially, my stolen truck. A few days later, Agent Thompson called me with some exciting news. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "we've located your truck." My heart leaped. "You have? Where is it?" "It was being stored in a warehouse on the outskirts of town," he explained, "the same warehouse we believe is being used to launder money. Your truck was being used to transport some of the illicit funds." He told me they were planning a raid on the warehouse and that they expected to recover my truck during the operation. He couldn't give me a specific timeline, but he assured me that they were working as quickly as possible. The waiting was agonizing. I spent the next few days glued to the news, hoping to see a report about the raid. Finally, it came. A local news channel reported that the FBI had raided a warehouse in connection with a large-scale money laundering investigation, and that several arrests had been made. Later that day, Agent Thompson called me again. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "the raid was successful. We recovered your truck. It's a little worse for wear, but it's mostly intact. You can pick it up from the impound lot tomorrow." I couldn't believe it. After weeks of feeling helpless and violated, I was finally getting my truck back. It wasn't just a truck, it was a symbol of hope, a sign that justice was finally being served. The relief washed over me, a wave of gratitude and vindication. I was one step closer to reclaiming my life and putting this nightmare behind me. The real fireworks, however, were yet to come. A few days after the warehouse raid, I woke up to a cacophony of sirens and flashing lights. I looked out the window and couldn't believe my eyes. The street was swarming with FBI agents, SWAT teams, and police cars. The focus of all this attention. The Miller's house. I watched in stunned silence as agents swarmed the property, shouting commands and ordering everyone inside to come out with their hands up. The Millers emerged, looking dazed and confused, followed by several other individuals I had never seen before. They were all handcuffed and led away. But the biggest shock came when I saw Brenda, HOA Karen herself, being escorted out of her house, her face pale and drawn. She was wearing a bathrobe and slippers, and she looked utterly defeated. As she was led past my house, she glanced in my direction, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and shame. The news reports later revealed the full extent of the operation. The Millers and Brenda were charged with multiple counts of money laundering, conspiracy, and fraud. They had been using the landscaping business and the warehouse to funnel millions of dollars in illegal funds, and Brenda had been instrumental in helping them to cover their tracks. It turned out that she wasn't just a petty HOA tyrant, she was a key player in a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The HOA harassment had been a way to keep unwanted attention away from the neighborhood, and my stolen truck had been used to transport cash and other contraband. The irony was almost too much to bear. All those petty violations, all that condescending attitude, all that wasted energy, had been masking a much darker secret. And I, the ordinary IT guy with a love for his vintage truck, had inadvertently stumbled upon it all. The takedown was complete, and my suburban nightmare was finally coming to an end. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The media descended on our quiet suburban neighborhood like a flock of vultures. Everyone wanted to talk to the ordinary IT guy who helped the FBI take down a money laundering ring. I gave a few interviews, but I quickly grew tired of the attention. I just wanted to go back to my normal life. The HOA was in chaos. The remaining board members were scrambling to distance themselves from Brenda and to reassure residents that the organization was under new management. There were calls for a complete overhaul of the HOA rules and regulations, and for a more transparent and accountable system of governance. I finally got my truck back, but it wasn't the same. It was scratched and dented, and the interior smelled faintly of something I couldn't quite place. But it was mine, and I was grateful to have it back. I spent weeks cleaning and repairing it, trying to restore it to its former glory. The whole experience left me shaken. I had learned that even the most ordinary-seeming people could be capable of extraordinary things, both good and bad. I had also learned that sometimes, the best thing you can do is to trust your instincts, even when they seem crazy. I started to feel restless in my suburban home. The sense of safety and security I had once taken for granted was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was still out there, waiting to get revenge. I seriously considered moving. I thought about selling my house and moving to a new city, a place where no one knew my name, a place where I could start over. But then I looked at my truck, sitting in the driveway, a symbol of my resilience and my determination. And I realized that I couldn't run away. This was my home, and I wasn't going to let a bunch of criminals force me to leave. In the end, I stayed. I couldn't let Brenda and the Millers win. I wasn't going to let them steal my peace of mind. The HOA underwent a complete transformation. The old guard was swept away, replaced by a new board committed to transparency and accountability. The rules and regulations were revised, making them less restrictive and more reasonable. The atmosphere in the neighborhood improved dramatically. People started talking to each other again, and there was a renewed sense of community. I even got involved in the HOA myself, serving on a committee to improve communication between the board and the residents. It wasn't something I ever thought I would do, but I wanted to make sure that what happened with Brenda never happened again. The experience also gave me a new appreciation for neighborhood watch programs. I joined the local watch group, and I started paying more attention to what was going on around me. I realized that even in the most ordinary suburban neighborhood, there was always the potential for something extraordinary to happen. It took time, but eventually, I found my peace of mind again. The nightmares faded, the paranoia subsided, and I started to feel safe in my home. I even started to enjoy working on my truck again, without the fear of receiving another petty violation notice. The whole experience changed me. I was no longer just an ordinary IT guy, I was a survivor, a fighter, a champion of my community. And although I would never wish what happened on anyone, I wouldn't trade the lessons I learned for anything. I learned the importance of standing up for what you believe in, the power of community, and the resilience of the human spirit. And, of course, I learned to never underestimate an HOA Karen.